Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our third and final session on this symposium, Performing Society, here at the MMK in Frankfurt. We are heading towards the end of the day, but hopefully not towards the end of society. I am very happy to introduce our next speaker, Markus Gabriel. He will focus and analyze the disagreement and, moreover, the dialectics of that what holds together our society. Markus Gabriel is one of the leading exponents of New Realism, a philosophical movement that emerged in the 20th century, and you can correct me afterwards, and was brought to life again during the last couple of years. Markus Gabriel holds the chair for epistemology, modern and contemporary philosophy at the University of Bonn. He is also the director of the International Center for Philosophy in Bonn, as well as the Multidisciplinary Center for Science and Thought, which he co-directs with a physicist. He has held faculty and visiting positions at New York University, Berkeley, Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, Heidelberg, and the New School for Social Research in New York. In addition to his academic work, he's also written popular books about philosophical issues. His book, Why the World Does Not Exist, has been translated into remarkable 14 languages and became an international bestseller. Markus Gabriel, thank you for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing you talk about the sticky and, let's say, gluey thing that society is, with the title Fiction, Imagination and Social Facts, the Dialectical Glue of Society. Please, the stage is yours.
Well, first of all, thanks to Susanne and Anna for putting such an exciting and terrific event together. As always, been a great pleasure to be working with you. We had so many wonderful occasions in the past, and we run into each other in beautiful places. Venice, we just run into each other, and Paris, and so forth. So we have a nice intellectual and personal history. So fantastic occasion to continue some exchange of thoughts on shared topics of concern. So I will speak about fictions, the imagination, and the dialectical glue of society, which is a 628 pages book, which forthcoming with Surkamp in May in 40 minutes. But I will give you just the conceptual, endoskeleton of the operations, right? So the fundamental idea is to answer the question what the social is. So this is going to be an exercise in social ontology. I think there are responses to the question, what is the social? So what sets something social apart from something non-social? I think there are clearly non-social facts. I have no reason to doubt that. If you want a long defense of that, we can talk about this, but I think it's pretty nonsensical to deny it. So I'm not gonna, try to convince anyone who denies the following that it's true, but here's what it is. There are planets, fermions, microbes, the Big Bang, that's slightly more contested, the inflation of the universe, the number 7, and blah, blah, blah. So there are all these things. And many of them, the ones I mentioned, are in no relevant sense social. The words I use in order to designate them have a social aspects. They're words, right? But also the meaning of those words is not social. That would be another terrible mistake to make in philosophy of language. Meaning is obviously not just social, because there's no meaning in general without reference, and the conditions for reference to exist might be social, but what I refer to isn't, and what I refer to is essentially part of language. So if I talk about whatever this podium, right, then this podium is of course not part of the social conditions on meaning, right? Even though the podium, of course, wouldn't be there had it not been for the coordinated activity of humans. Voila, the first response to what the social is. So my talk has then 3 parts, fictions. I will first talk about fictions, because there's this intuition, right, that there's something fictional about society, democracy, people, Europeans, or whatever, right? So big social terms, right, have been suspected, justice and so forth, of being fictions. Either useful fictions, heuristic fictions, or evil ideological fictions, or whatever. So people throw out fictionalist jargon without usually responding to the question what a fiction is. So I will do that first. And then you will see that I do not think that the social is fictional, so I think this is misguided. When we see what a fiction is. Then I will talk about imagination, so you might think that, well, then it's imaginary, right? Benedict Anderson, whatever, imagined communities, then it's not fictional, it's imaginary, right? Then I will argue that it's also not imaginary. And then in my last part, I will give you a realist social ontology, according to which human animals, I will only speak about human animals without suggesting or thinking or even going into the issue at all here, right? I have views about that, but they don't matter about the sociality of other animals. Yeah? So certainly there are other animals are social too, and maybe in the same sense, but I'm just not going to be interested in that, right? This is not denying them any kinds of rights or whatever, right? It's just not going to be my topic. I will just focus on the paradigm case of human sociality, and and then you will see that humans are, in a relevant sense, socially produced by way of sexual production and reproduction, but nothing, as I will argue in my last part, is socially constructed. So I think that the category of social construction is entirely empty, and I will just give you like a brief survey then of a couple of standard models. The Judith Butler model, which is confused, the John Searle model, which is confused, and the worst one, the Sally Haslanger model. They're all confused when as they try to say what it would mean for something to be socially constructed. So I offer a surrogate notion which does the job that social construction was designed to do, but really does the job. I just call it social production. There's some Baudrillard and oublié Foucault and whatever in the background, so if you want like radical leftist credentials, I can give you some, but that's not, that's just not going to be on my agenda, right? So I'm interested in the issues and not whether someone, who has like those credentials also holds the views. Okay, so let's start with fictions. What are fictions, right? So fictional objects, such as Jette Martin, the protagonist of Map and Territory by Michel Houellebecq, Faust and Gretchen, and so forth, and the president in House of Cards, those fictional objects, Sherlock Holmes and so forth, are essentially interpretation dependent. So an object is essentially interpretation dependent if and only if it only has all its properties that it needs in order to be it, if someone performs a certain activity, which I call interpretation. Think of interpretation along the model of the interpretation or the performance of a score, right? So you have the score of whatever Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or whatever is your score that you want to have in the music case, or a text, or a painting, right? Let's call that a score. And the exercise of performing that score in your mind, right? Either literally playing the music, or hearing a symphony play it, and so forth, or reading a text, or interpreting a painting, by imagining certain things and so forth. I call that exercise an aesthetic experience or an interpretation. And fictional objects only have the properties they are needed to have in order to be them, so for their self-identity relative to an interpretation. So this has the following consequence. Take whatever Gretchen from Faust. Is Gretchen blonde? Some might say, yeah, of course, she's German, right? And then some might say, are you crazy? Why are Germans blonde, right? I mean, what happened to you? She might have whatever, so you can imagine Gretchen in any way. So do you make a mistake if you think that Gretchen has, this hair color or this just number of hairs? Does Gretchen at a given point in time, what kind of a haircut does she have in prison, right? How many, she probably has either an odd or even number of hairs, right? But now you are, as an interpreter, perfectly entitled to answer that question without looking into a mind-independent reality, right? There's no mind or interpretation-independent reality which settles all of the properties of Gretchen, right? So Gretchen, in that sense, is a fictional object. That's the famous theorem of the incompleteness of fictional objects. However, you are entitled to complete those objects. So you're not making a mistake if you complete those objects in an interpretation. That's not a mistake. If you complete my properties in an interpretation, so if you have beliefs about what I will do later tonight, right, or what I did yesterday, or what I believe and so forth, right, if you have beliefs about that, then you're not entitled to interpret me in any way that suits the coherence of your interpretation. You can just make a mistake. If you think that I'm going to Munich tonight, well, you're just making a mistake. But if you think that Gretchen is going to Munich between the scenes, right? So she's sometimes shown by the play and the score. There's something, there's the inscription Gretchen, and then Gretchen does such and such, right? And then in between, what happens between the scenes, right? Does she buy a burger? So you're entitled to interpret that, the lacuna, without making a mistake. But you'll make a mistake if you do that with me. So that would be a fictional object. Now, if you think that big social categories, such as the social itself, or society, or democracy, or justice, or whatever matters, or gender, if you think they're fictional, then you think that you can just fill out the missing properties relative to your whim. More or less, there are limits of interpretation. That would be a different story, right? Not anything goes. I'm not making that point. There are limits of interpretation set by the score. Not any performance of Faust is going to be a good performance of Faust, right? Faust in a burger restaurant, but Faust as not saying anything and being a green, slimy pyramid. So if that's different, right? Faust, the one score. I'm not talking about more subtle Faust, right? That would be, I wouldn't even dare in the presence of Susanne to give like a whole history of Faust or that particular moment in the Biennale. But there are limits of interpretation, and therefore there are criteria of success. I'm just mentioning that, not defending it, okay? Because what I need today is just the interpretation dependence and not the theorem that interpretations are limited by standards of adequacy and legitimacy. That can vary historically, blah, 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 right? But I don't need to fill this out at this point. All I need is the interpretation dependence. Now, is, say, democracy or justice or gender or the role of being a speaker right now and you being an audience and so forth, is that in that sense interpretation dependent? No, because you're not entitled to fill out, right, at your own whim what it means. This is what you will notice when you get a problem with the legal system. You're like, oh yeah, let's just fill out the meaning of democracy and people for Germany. Let's just fill this out, right, and you have your own interpretation. A la Reichsbürger say, so you imagine you're a Reichsbürger and that's your interpretation of Germany, then sooner or later you'll get into legal trouble. And then you realize, oh, there are some facts, complicated legal facts, and the word democracy, among other things, just refers to a certain set of institutionally bound legal conditions. This is one aspect of the meaning of the word democracy as we use it right now. So they are not fictional objects. Not in that sense of fictional. They're not like Mephistopheles, ontologically speaking. So that's a bad analogy. So let's look, part 2, at imaginations. So you might say, well, then they're imaginary. Whatever. Castoriadis, the imaginary constitution of society, is a theory according to which the social is essentially dependent on imagination. So let's see what is imagination. So here's a proposal, at least how I want to use this term, one way of fixing the meaning theoretically of an imagination. Take the case where imagination clearly is instantiated, namely that of perception. So right now, I see you from here. But I know that you are not from here. I see you from here, right? But I can totally abstract from the fact that I see you from here in perception by knowing that you are there. I don't think that you're there from here. You're just there. So I can abstract from the perspectival condition on perceptual representation and know that if you're there, then I can perceive you in whatever complicated causal way, and if not, then just not. So I have the capacity of abstracting from my access to perception, and let's call my perspectival representation that is constitutive of the state of conscious perception. I couldn't perceive you without it. Let's call that imaginary. Because it is illusionary, a kind of illusion in a technical sense, right? All perception is like perceptual illusion. If you think about whatever, think about your favorite perceptual illusion, then once you know that something is a perceptual illusion, it doesn't go away famously, right? So you have a perceptual trick, and now you know this is an illusion. It even tells you, someone explains to you the Miller-Lyer illusion where two lines are actually equally long. By the way, they're not. You cannot draw two equally long lines. So this is already a false thing to say about the Miller-Lyer illusion. The lines are equally long. There aren't any equally long lines in reality that you can perceive. So that's actually false. But they're kind of equally long. And then there are the different arrows, and you think of one, you perceive the one as shorter than the other, whilst you know that they are roughly equally long, but it doesn't go away. Yeah? Now, I want to say that this is clearly a case of imagination, right? But I think perception always has this element. I see you, for instance, right now in a distorted space, and the distortion from here, just think of two rails, right? You see two rails, and they seem to meet, right, on the horizon if you stand in front of them. Why? But you know they don't, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't board on that train. Right? If you thought that, you're like, don't take the train, right? It will be derailed. Yeah, well, you know, by abstracting from your perspective that those rails are, again, roughly speaking, parallels. They're not geometrical parallels in a Euclidean space, but this is not a deep point about Einsteinian relativity. This is a point about perceptual space from your standpoint. Yeah? So let's call that imagination. Imagination is operative in perception because there isn't any conscious perception, at least. I will not talk about non-conscious perception. It's not so clear whether non-conscious perception is also perspectival. So it might be that consciousness and imagination hang together in a very deep way. There are good reasons for thinking that, Kant and everything, but we can bracket them. And just, think about conscious perception as a paradigm case, and now let that be imaginary. Yeah. And now here's a very important fact about human mental life that I think misleads people into thinking about social facts as fictional and imaginary and so forth. So humans lead a life in light of a conception of scenes that transcend the immediately given. So it's not very hard for us to think about us being in Frankfurt right now. But you don't see all of Frankfurt or whatever. You're in some part of Frankfurt. But it doesn't take a great effort unless you have a serious problem. We will classify this as a problem, right? If you're like, what, I'm in Frankfurt, right? Then, and it doesn't go away, right? And I talk to you and so forth, and you persist, and it's like, I don't know if I'm in Frankfurt, and so forth. Then sooner or later, I would come up with a pathological explanation, it's like what happened to her, and so forth, right? But clearly, you can perceive of reality as transcending what is given to you in the form of immediate imagination. That's not so hard. Someone is out there are like restrooms, and we're in a museum and so forth, right? So you transcend the immediately given. And while you transcend the immediately given in your cognitive life, you will make recourse to fictional elements. You will tell stories and so forth, right? Which function as simulations of future behavior. So I have a whole story to tell about how likely it is that my train will be punctured and so forth, and I have myths and discussions about the Deutsche Bahn, and then we all complain and so forth, right? When I simulate what is going to happen later tonight, and some of this is indeed going to be fictional because there's some storytelling involved that doesn't refer to anything. So Heidegger has this interesting question where you can test your intuitions, where you stand on this in some of his earlier lectures about the train station of Marburg. So in his seminar in Freiburg, he discusses whether him imagining right now, right, the train station in Marburg, he is thinking about the train station in Marburg or not. And remarkably, we might say, well, there's one difference between Heidegger clearly thinking about the train station in Marburg, and Heidegger kind of not so entirely clearly thinking about the train station in Marburg. So imagine Heidegger imagines the train station in Marburg right now while being in Freiburg, but it has just been destroyed by Bertrand Russell. Russell is like, let's screw up his thought experiment, stupid Nazi propaganda philosopher, and and they throw bombs at the train station of Marburg while Heidegger is imagining it. And then you'll see Heidegger's imagination of it won't change, right? So it's not a truth-tracking attitude, right? So clearly it's not a kind of perception. And you might wonder whether Heidegger there is really thinking about the train station in Marburg. It's not so obvious. I won't take a full stance, but here you see that those transcending aspects of the human mind, without which we couldn't act in the present moment. So I'm totally against Buddhism here. Let me be frank about this. Live in the moment, meditation, and so forth. This is like, don't be human. Don't be someone. That's part of the message, right? The no-self view, which is like fancy now in America, Buddhism and neuroscience and so forth. I think this is a disaster, right? And similarly, if you say something like there shouldn't be fictions and imaginations, we need the bare, real, and so forth, then the mistake that you're making, terrible mistake, is very simple confusion, namely the following: fictions are real. Imaginations are real. It's not that fictions hide the real, or imaginations hide the real. In the case of perception, imagination is the vehicle of acquaintance, to use a recent term by David Chalmers. So with imagination, thanks to imagination, you are immediately in touch with reality. It's not that imagination is a kind of veil or distorting medium in which you make an appearance. Imagination is part of reality. It's even causal. Imagination is a causal part of reality that you can characterize with decent causal models. It's an irreduced part of reality, your mental life. So if you think of imagination and fiction and transcendence over the present moment as somehow less real compared to some weird standard of reality, then you're making the mistake of thinking of your own subjectivity as not real. So you're already abstracting from a whole range of facts that are very important to keep in mind if you want to understand the human position. And if you don't even have the tools for conceptualizing the human position, then forget about then of course you cannot think about the social and democracy and justice and pain and so forth, because you don't think of it as real in the first place. So that's not a discovery. Look, that stuff isn't real. It's a theory failure. So if you think that that stuff isn't real, then that is the consequence of mistakes that you made earlier in setting up your conceptual toolbox, according to the view that I'm presenting. Of course that's real. It's as thick as it gets, right? Aesthetic experience. What more do you want from reality? You're in front of a great painting and so forth, right? And then there's the whole exercise of interpretation and reinterpretation and talking to experts for modern art like Susanne and so forth, right? And figuring out what this means and changing and so forth. All of this is a fully real process, right? Even though it's fictional and imaginary and so forth. So that's just not the contrast. The contrast is not between the real and the imaginary. Otherwise, you also get into paradoxes and so forth with objects that exist and don't exist. So it's not very wise to draw that kind of distinction. It's a bad mistake. I've given it the name of old realism, and I'm a new realist. So I'm a realist without that mistake. That's what new realism on this level just means. Realism without tears. And okay, so next step. So those are some, clarifications of how to think about those categories. So imagination is a form of representation, which plays a very important role in the human life form, paradigmatically instantiated in the case of conscious perception. Fiction is an exercise of interpretation where you are dealing with fictional objects. You can also call them fictitious objects if you like, if and only if those objects have properties relative to your interpretation. Now, I think none of this applies to the social case specifically. So fictions and imaginations are social, as you will now see, but that does not mean that their targets in the social case, like justice or group behavior and so forth, are therefore fictitious, like Gretchen and so forth. Right? So the categorical level of society and family and a court and umpires and so forth, these social objects, nation states and political violence or whatever, and museums, right? That ontology is not at all that of Gretchen and Faust and so forth, even though they hang together, these ontologies. But they are not in the same category of entities. So let's look at the important then category of entities that we are talking about here in performing society, namely the social or social facts. So let me try to give you an answer by way of eliding an earlier prominent answer, which leads to the idea of social construction, right? We have heard a lot, so something like the following is very prominent in critique. Such and such is not natural, such and such is historically contingent, therefore also such and such is bad for some reason, right? It kills people, it hurts people, it represses minorities, whatever now the criterion for injustice is that we deploy. And the good news is, given that it's not natural and so forth, we can change it, right? So that is the emancipatory idea associated with the term social construction. That's why anyone is even so much as interested in this in the first place. This is how it came into being, because it looks like if you make this discovery that such and such is socially constructed, then at least you have the tools for thinking of it as being changeable, right? That's kind of associated with that. But now let's look at how people model that social construction. And so here are a couple of candidates. Let's look at the clearest and therefore also most obviously false model, or problematic model, that by John Searle. So Searle's notion goes something like this from speech act theory, which we heard this morning, a version thereof, which leads into a trouble with the social. Searle has answers to that, Natasha didn't, but that's another topic. So Searle's model is this, right? So what makes an institution an institution? His example is always paper money, that's just his example. So he would just show you a $20 bill, I won't do it, I also don't have one, and then say, look, this is only money if we recognize it as money. If not, it's just a bunch of matter, right? It's just paper. So the existence of social facts in the Searlean model depends on us accepting and recognizing something as social. So the social is, if you want a slogan, in the eye of the beholder, right? The social is like a projection in the case of the perception of your beautiful partner, right? So you just fell in love with someone, and then this person, and you're incredibly attracted to that person, right? And then you fall out of love later, and you wonder how he, she, they were like so unattractive in the first place, right? What happened? And then the glimmer goes away, and you're like, damn, right? Like in Kleist writes about this, and there are like funny ways of thinking about this, and this has happened to everyone. And then you might say, look, it was just in the eye of the beholder, right? And so similarly, Searle thinks that institutions are in the eye of just many beholders, right? So so and so many people believe that a piece of paper can be exchanged for whatever ice cream, and therefore it can. Yeah. Think of, again, the standard model of Austinian speech act performatives and so forth, right? I hereby baptize you, John, right? John's name is John in virtue of him having been baptized. Yeah. So he thinks there's a world to mind direction of fit, his word, where the world, whether someone is baptized or not, depends on the mind. Yeah. Like a magic trick, but in this case it just works. John. Yeah. And now John is John in virtue of this. Right? And there's an institution in the background which allows the baptism, whatever a state or a church or whatever the practice is, right? And that institution too, according to John, is there because of this, right? So you might say, well, the baptism requires an institution, and then John would say, well, but the institution requires, again, something like a second-order baptism, yeah? Bringing things into existence in virtue of recognizing them, and be it non-consciously. Recognition and so need not be conscious. That would just be a stupid view, right? So he thinks there can be non-conscious institutions which just come into being in virtue of people's behavior, right? They just don't notice, and then it's an institution, and sooner or later they call it whatever, a kingdom. But the view is this, but it leads into a regress in Searle's case, because what about language? According to Searle, language is the fundamental institution without which we wouldn't have performative speech acts. But given that language too is an institution, language does not come into existence thanks to language, right? So he says, yeah, that's an exception. So here, he's like, for all institutions such and such, except for language. So that is obviously a theory failure where you can see something's wrong if that's the view, right? I mean, you might also just endorse the view, but something's wrong. So here's what I think is wrong in the first place. The social is just not in the eye of the beholder. Otherwise, the following simple thought experiment, which he says pans out in the way in which he wants it to pan out, would work, right? So his example is this. So there's the economic crisis in 2008, and people are worried, oh, it's the economic crisis. And then Searle would just recommend that we all forget it. We just stop recognizing it. So all humans gather, right? Or there's like a declaration on Facebook and Twitter and all social media, and cars drive through cities and radios, and people go to all the villages and tell them, we have a problem. There's an economic crisis. We want you to not believe that. And then they're all like, okay, let's stop believing in the economic crisis. And then according to Searle, it would just stop existing, right? If we just stop believing that Angela Merkel is the chancellor, and then she's not. If a sufficient amount of people just stops believing that, then she isn't, according to that model. And there you see that, you bring things into existence just in virtue of being committed to them being in existence, and this is also how you maintain them into existence. That's the theory. Yeah. And now Sally Haslinger, in her book Resisting Reality, tries to turn that model, which is politically and so forth completely neutral, it's just a social ontology. She tries to translate that into a progressive view, resisting reality, and she holds a view of the form that certain words only have a socially constructed meaning, and therefore certain practices have only a socially constructed meaning. And if we just think about those practices collectively in a different way, then those practices, in virtue of us thinking about them in a different way, just go away. They just go away. And so we just need to talk to each other more and transmit the idea that such and such is socially constructed and that it's harmful, and then it just goes away. Yeah. That would be great. Then we could just really make the revolution in this room by just talking very loud about it, right? But weirdly enough, this hasn't happened, right? So this is, to say the least, empirically falsified, that idea. Unless you're a Heideggerian or Foucauldian, which is just Heidegger in a different code, where you think that, but somehow I can just enter the Gestell or power in Foucault's sense, right? I can just go in there, right? And then I will just, put on my loudspeakers of being in the case of Heidegger, or my loudspeakers or whatever in the case of Foucault, and then I just broadcast justice, right? Heidegger didn't want to broadcast justice; he wanted to broadcast Hitler, like Hitler, but that's the broadcasting view, right? So you could just change social reality in virtue of broadcasting the news that it has changed now, right? That just doesn't work, and no one does that. It would be a terrible mistake also to read Trump in this way. Sometimes people have said, right, Trump is like Nietzsche or Foucault. He's, using the tools of critical theory in order to establish post-truth and so forth. He's not doing that at all. He's establishing social facts and then also broadcasting nonsense, which is then in turn a social fact, which can be measured socioeconomically in terms of the number of people following him, the amount of electromagnetic radiation used in order to maintain the Twitter and so forth, right? This is just blatantly real, but it looks very much like a postmodern performance. It isn't. Yeah? So that's what I'm suggesting. I'm saying there isn't any postmodern performance. There isn't any society of the spectacle and so forth. There are spectacles, right? But they're much more real than we think, because the spectacle reality distinction is flawed in the same way in which the fiction reality distinction is flawed, and so forth. That's the background idea here. So now, on a more positive note, then what is the social? I want to close with that and show you why there's a dialectics involved. So it's not going to be just smooth. Yeah. So something is social, I suggest. Let me just define it, right? And then we can discuss about it. If and only if it is produced by dissent. Yeah? And dissent, by dissent, I mean not the declaration of a difference of opinion. That's one way of dissenting, explicit disagreement. But this can be as low level as us looking from different points of view onto the same object. So I see the bottle from here, you see the bottle from there, right? And the fact that there's just one bottle that we both see can mediate between our two perspectives. And that's what we teach our children by directing their points of view, right? That's what you do with little human animals. It already happens in the womb because there's social production way before those babies are visible to us, as it were, in open air, right? We direct their behavior, right? We make them move, right? We lie them in our beds in a certain way. It's habitus production, to use Bourdieu's term, but I think of this as entirely material. Gene expression in human animals is social. So you have stem cells at the beginning, and then they get expressed into neural tissue and skin tissue and so forth. There are different cell types in humans, and they get expressed from stem cells. And the gene expression in human animals is already social in virtue of the mother who's carrying the baby, right, realizing the gene expression, doing certain things, like eating, sleeping, and so forth, right, talking to people. All of this is part of the causal context, which is a social context of coordinated activity. So the social is human coordinated activity which results from dissent. And an institution is a consensus management system. So you have dissent, and dissent can go in all sorts of ways, right? I can say, look, there's a bottle here. And then maybe you start disagreeing with me for some reason or other, right? You're like, don't be so snobbish about reality. This is not a bottle. And now you give me a different description of what you think is going on here. A super complicated object involving marketing and strategies and ideology and of being green while it's plastic. And you can tell a whole super complicated story about this. But then there's going to be a mechanism of establishing minimal consent between us. And that is an institution. In that sense, language is an institution, but also just making human babies grow is an institution. And human sexual reproduction is based on dissent and consent management, which is why there's all sorts of obvious ethics involved with human sexual production and reproduction. And we become more and more aware of this as a consequence of just modern insights into human and biology, right? We just know more about this. So, for instance, a good reason for allowing abortion up to a certain point in time is not just that the woman needs to be able to decide. That's a very good reason. But also, for instance, that when you just have a bunch of stem cells in you, which could turn into a human animal, and you get rid of those cells, right? Then this is just like cutting your hair or a fingernail. You could just get rid of a bunch of cells, and that might be a very good thing to do under lots of obvious conditions. Things change when there's a whole animal that is socially produced in adequate ways, and that's an incredibly complicated ethical position, but we only have access to the fact that there is some relevant ethical insight associated with insight into human molecular biology, thanks to, voila, molecular biology. So human biology is fundamentally social, which is not to say, right, don't get me wrong, that human sociality is biological. I'm not making a point of the form that the discipline of biology is the adequate tool for understanding human society. That's not true. Right? I'm not defending that view at all. There's also sociology and political science, and they cannot be reduced to biology. So that would also be a mistake. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the human is indeed a social animal, and our animality, so just the fact that we are organisms of a certain kind, the human kind, is a consequence of social production. And that is not in the eye of the beholder. So the social, that's just the argument, right? The social cannot be in the eye of the beholder. Now you might say maybe something social is in the eye of the beholder, and there I would say, well, the eye of the beholder quite literally is social. Not because it's in the eye of the beholder, right? But that's again a Bourdieuian basic insight, that the way in which you perceive is indeed socially produced in virtue of certain practices of being directed by people that you grew up with and so forth, right? So the eye of the beholder is socially produced, but that doesn't mean that the social is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah? So on one view, the social constructivism view that I'm rejecting, you're imposing the social onto a non-social layer. And then radical constructivists just deny the non-social layer, and just go for, as it were, pure imposition, and then society is a form of hallucination. That's one view. There is no society, only blah, blah, blah. We've heard that Thatcher quote, right? And on that view, society is a kind of hallucination, and then you kind of need to explain this away as a bad habit of thinking or whatever you want to do with it, right? And the radical constructivists famously just also deny the existence of anything that is not social. That's simpler then, because you don't need to hold a view according to which you impose the social onto something non-social, but the view is not better, because now you're saying, I'm imposing the social onto the social. Then you're just piling up the social, and you're digging deep, and then at some point or other you can say no one knows, right? So you don't dig deep enough, so you always start like 10,000 years ago with the first documents, right? But you never dig deeper, because what would happen then is either you wind up with a terrible regress where it's social, and then what, the Big Bang is social, right? So usually people at this point don't dig that deep, right? They dig 10,000 years ago, and then it all looks very social on those histories. And on what I'm suggesting then, the social is indeed like a causally real element in in the production of human consciousness and self-consciousness. So we are indeed fundamentally social, which does not mean, okay, last confusion I want to get rid of, and then I leave the rest for discussion, which does not mean that the objects of the states that are socially produced, such as conscious perception, right, or more complicated forms of knowledge acquisition, such as knowing one's way around Frankfurt, or you know, understanding the asylum rights of migrants or whatever. These are complicated, high-level social states. What I'm saying is the following. It's not the case that all objects of socially produced states are social. The moon isn't. But you couldn't know anything about the moon had it not been for the fact that you are social animals in the sense in which I said that you're social animals. So there's no reason to think of, as it were, all of reality as socially produced in light of what I have just said. Now, we can talk about details, right? So this has consequences, of course, for how we think about certain urgent political and so forth issues, including, you know, gender and climate and so forth. Obviously, there are consequences, but none of what I have said on this ontological level, you know, gives you a clear prediction of what the right thing to say about those things is, except that we rule out a lot of false beliefs, right? So pro-life, for instance, American style is ruled out because it turns out that a bunch of cells is not a dude. So you can't say, well, that's already a human baby, it is, you know, human dignity. Well, it's not, it's a bunch of cells. That's also not a human, it's part of a human. And so the first two cells, which made up what later became me, were not me. I wasn't, they're part of my history, but in the way in which my ear is part of my history, right? Or it's much lower level. So there are consequences of what I'm saying for when we think about these urgent political issues. But fundamentally, the strategy is to ground our political decision-making in a realist level of theorizing so that we don't get into the battleground position that we're currently in from all sides of political perceived spectra, where people think of the social as just purely a battleground of who has the bigger arms and fights off the other party. If this is the model for the social, then democracy stands no chance. So I will leave it at that. And I'm like a totally happy Democrat, by the way. So if, you know, people sometimes say that's really bad to be a Democrat and so forth, then I would say, well, then move to North Korea. Enjoy. Okay. And I leave the rest for discussion.